Dr. James Robertson, Jr. is one of the most distinguished names in Civil War history. He was the executive director of the U.S. Civil War Centennial Commission and worked personally with Presidents Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson in marking the war's 100th anniversary. Today, the Civil War era course at Virginia Tech is the largest of its kind in the nation. He is a Virginia native, and he's the author of more than 20 books. Of great acclaim is his biography, General Stonewall Jackson, which won 8 national awards and was used as the base for the Warner Brothers movie Gods and Generals, which, by the way, is being re-released here tomorrow night, right here at the Hilton Performing Arts Center. Dr. Robertson is one of the most sought-after speakers on Civil War history, and it is my distinct privilege to welcome him here today. Doctor?
Thank you very much, and it is indeed a pleasure to be with you on this momentous occasion, and my wife Betty and I truly appreciate the invitation to be here. Let me make 2 corrections in the introduction. Out of honesty, I must say, my book was not used for the movie Gods and Generals. My book on Jackson was used as the base for the role of Jackson in Gods and Generals, and Lord knows I was not the chief historical consultant. I was an historical consultant, and proud and happy to work with Ron Maxwell, one of the nicest men associated with Hollywood I've ever met, and that's a rare thing for me to say. But it's good to be here with you and to have a role in this momentous day for Prince William County as well as for the Commonwealth. Shortly after the battle, a soldier informed the home folk, "Our men fought well and stood like heroes." He was from Maine. At the same time, another infantryman stated, "Our brave men fell in great numbers, but they died fighting in the holy cause of liberty." That soldier was from Alabama. Both of them were giving new meaning to the word patriotism. However, they were fighting each other in the most traumatic and the most transformational event in American history. The killing process began in productive fields and quiet woods near a railroad junction known as Manassas and along an innocent stream misnamed Bull Run. It was the starting point for the nation's largest war. Now, many Americans find the Civil War inspiring. Others find it embarrassing. Whatever the case, the struggle earned undying remembrance, not merely for what it was, but for what it gave us. Now, history is never simple. To say that slavery per se caused the Civil War does not imply that every soldier had slavery on his mind when he marched away to war. The great majority of Southerners fought and died without owning slaves or intending to do so. Thousands of Billy Yanks surged forth in battle with no intention to free anybody. Yet it was slavery that had broken the nation into 2 parts and doomed its people to fight over whether that nation was coming back together again. The truth in Civil War history is not a story of heroes on one side and villains on another. Actually, few true stories are that way. This one began in December 1860 when South Carolina began a freedom movement. 6 other states followed suit, created the Confederate States of America, and asked only to be left alone. Newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln had no intention of allowing such a situation. The nation that would stand passively by and watch itself disintegrate, Lincoln believed, was unworthy of the name nation. And so in the spring of 1861, North and South prepared for a physical contest. Only a few individuals saw the nightmare that lay ahead. One of them was Robert E. Lee, who observed that spring, "There is a terrible war coming, and these young men who have not seen war wait innocently for it to happen." And on the other side, a former unimpressive soldier who was kind of here today and gone tomorrow to some people. His name was William T. Sherman. And he predicted in the spring of '61, this country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. The 4-year struggle that followed abides deep in the soul of America in general, and the Old Dominion in particular. As long as there is a United States, that war will not go away, nor should it. The war is not some closed chapter in our dusty past. It is the high watermark of our national history, the starting point from which we measure the dimensions of just about everything that has happened to us since. Some writers dismiss Virginia as merely the headland of the Confederacy. The Old Dominion had the natural resources, the manpower, the foodstuffs, as no other southern state did. It was not the headland of the Confederacy, it was the heartland, literally the head and the heart of the southern nation. The body cannot function without a head and a heart. To lose Virginia, therefore, was to lose the war. And that is why 3 of every 5 Civil War engagements occurred in this state. Virginia mobilized quickly for war. Prince William County sent 100-man companies into the 4th Virginia Cavalry, the 17th and 49th Virginia Infantry Regiments. Yet its greatest manpower contributions were to the 8th Virginia, initially a 1,000-man regiment. The 8th Virginia fought in every major battle of the war in the East, save one. It became known as the Bloody Eighth. Of 1,000 men who served in that regiment at Appomattox, 11 were left. One Prince William County family certainly made its mark in the war. There were 4 Berkeley brothers who enlisted together in the same regiment. Norman Berkeley became colonel of the 8th Virginia. His brother Edmund was the lieutenant colonel. Their brother William was the regimental major, and Charles was a senior captain. All were wounded at some point in the war. 3 of the 4 were captured and held as prisoners of war. Prince William County did not expect to be the site of the opening battle. However, in mid-July 1861, 2 armed mobs posing as armies crept into position southwest of Centerville. Incidentally, a New York officer passing through the village that spring wrote this description of Centerville. He thought it, quote, the coldest picture conceivable of municipal smallness and decrepitude. It looks for all the world as though it had done its business, whatever that was, fully 80 years ago, and since then had bolted its doors, put out the fires, and gone to sleep. Confederate Generals Beauregard and Johnston waited with their forces aligned alongside the Warrington Turnpike, US 29, and Bull Run. In time, the Union host made its appearance. Federal General McDowell then sought to make a sweeping circular attack around the Confederate left flank. Now, that might have worked a year later when his uniformed boys had become seasoned soldiers. Yet everything about the Battle of First Manassas was disjointed except the killing and the maiming and the exhaustion from hours of disorganized combat. Boys that morning were adults by nightfall. The progress of the engagement has been told too often to be repeated here. To me, little things that Sunday have unforgettable meanings. An Alabama officer rode across the field to deliver a dispatch. His horse was struck and knocked down by 8 bullets. Before the horse could pick itself up from the ground, 5 other bullets slammed into the dead animal. Virginia soldier Frank Potts never forgot the first human being he killed. Potts recorded in his diary how at Manassas he watched the blue-clad soldier moving slowly toward him. I steadied my musket, Potts wrote, and aiming at his breast, I fired. I saw him no more. God have mercy on him. And then Potts sort of added a postscript to his diary entry. I was fighting for my home, and he had no business being here. In many respects, the real first Manassas came in the aftermath. Edwin Osborne, a Georgia soldier, walked over the field a couple of days after the fighting. The marks of the struggle were still plainly visible, Osborne wrote. Houses deserted, fields and crops trampled to ruin, and fragments of war were scattered here and there, while portions of the bodies of the men who had been covered with earth in ditches and ravines were exposed in many places. It was a scene of sickening desolation, and I was soon glad to return to camp. Another Georgian came upon a Confederate, he said, who, quote, weeping bitterly and wringing his hands over the stiff and blackened corpse of his brother who was fighting for the other side. A third soldier looked at the battlefield and informed his parents, I came to the conclusion that it was the most foolish thing imaginable for two civilized nations to meet and slaughter one another like animals. Well, this most foolish thing at Manassas was tragically just the overture for a 4-year killing time that would consume more Americans than have died in all of the nation's other wars combined. And it had to be that way. Each side, you see, was fighting for an absolute. The North for union, the South for independence. No middle ground existed. One side had to conquer, the other side had to be conquered. For Virginia, as you've heard this morning on the battlefield, the war exacted a terrible toll. A third of this state was torn from the Old Dominion and given a statehood of its own. Over 60% of Civil War engagements tore across Virginia's soil. No area of the Western Hemisphere has ever suffered more man-made destruction than Virginia in those 4 years. In November 1862, after only 16 months after the opening battle here at Manassas, a Connecticut regiment arrived at Manassas Junction. One member described the site of the land 16 months after the first Manassas. This is, he said, one of the most wretched, God-forsaking places I have ever seen. Nearly every building has been burned and not a living soul to be seen except soldiers. The country around has been stripped by everything, by both armies, and a man almost as soon would starve there as he would in the center of an Arabian desert. The slaughter at major battles such as Second Manassas, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor were stunning and sickening. Families north and south were devastated. Economic losses immeasurable. Most southern states were left a wasteland. Worst of all, close to 750,000 young men, a generation of Americans, were dead. And so were the achievements that each one of them might have made to posterity and mankind had it been otherwise. 700,000 plus may not mean much to you today, but if the same war erupted now in 4 years, the states lost the same number of fatalities and maimed now in proportion to modern population as happened in the American Civil War, this country would lose 6 million young men. 6 million would die and be crippled in 4 years. And this brings us to the Sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Great War that made us whole. I'm quite aware of the fact that 150 years ago, some of our forefathers were fighting some of your forefathers. And isn't it a miracle of modern times that just 150 years later, we sit here together to recount the deeds of old and to give blessings for the united country we have. It's a modern miracle, and I say that as a historian. Union victory in 1865 was decisive, but it was not complete. Winners, of course, usually write the history. Yet in the post-war South, the losers wrote their story of the war through historical markers, statues, customs, events, and mementos. And attempting to remove those symbols from the landscape is interpreted now by many as an attack on their heritage. a desecration of their history. And when I hear these kinds of assertions and gripings appear, I always wonder in my mind, how would those soldiers of yesteryear react today to such divisions of spirit? And the answer is simple. Johnny Rebs never expressed regrets for what they had done, and Billy Yanks never asked them to do so. I have never apologized for being a Southerner. I've never heard an intelligent reason why I should. Continuing our grievances with the past is a dead-end street. The past is the past. We cannot change it. We learn from it. That is the value of history. It's the only good teacher for the present and the future. Yet we must be careful of the educational tools we use. One of the greatest resources devised by mankind is also one of the most dangerous, and I refer to the World Wide Web. It is not the last word. It is not even the real word. In fact, it is an intellectual sewer where one can easily find fact, fiction, concoction, propaganda, all hidden under the guise of truth. Punching a computer is easy. I've been doing it for years. Taking more time to go to the original sources bears far greater rewards and far less catcalls. Genuine research into primary sources separates truth from mythology as it does fact from advocacy. Punching into Google is like joining Alice for a journey into Wonderland. And this is one reason why knowledge of history is so sadly lacking in our nation today. It is probably at an all-time low in the educational system of this country now. The Civil War is the biggest event in American history, and yet our children and grandchildren do not know it. In fact, American youth at this moment have unbelievably little knowledge of the country that Mr. Lincoln called the last great hope of earth. The past decade has seen so much emphasis placed on math and computer science that it has created an embarrassing lag in subjects such as history and geography. The 2010 National Assessment of Education Programs, long title, but it's known to us educators as the National Report Card, came out last month. It contains statistics for 12,000 high school graduates from all across the nation, done at graduation time, all across the country, 12,000 kids. The report showed that 87% of graduating seniors failed the American history portion of the test. Of 7 different categories on the national test, students performed worst in the field of American history. In short, our national heritage is the subject about which our younger generations know the least. And this is not shocking. It's frightening. This is not an indictment of our children. It should be a wake-up call for us all. We have got to do something to instill a greater knowledge of and respect for our national heritage. We are endangering our country by overlooking the past. How can anyone face tomorrow if you have no recollection of yesterday? How can our children write the next chapter of a story they do not know? The Civil War is an event that must be remembered for many reasons. It brought an end to slavery in a land that had long announced freedom for all. The war produced one of history's greatest figures in Abraham Lincoln, an unglamorous product of the American frontier, limited in education, untutored in national politics, downright ugly in appearance. Lincoln, nevertheless, had a love of country, a sense of decency, and the ability to communicate both to posterity. Further, although there was bitterness at the end of the war, there was also amazing compassion. Have you ever thought that Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis could well have been hanged for treason? Instead, they were allowed to rebuild their lives. Such does not normally occur in a civil war. We can be forever grateful that the South lost the contest. Otherwise, we would have become a balkanized continent without the strength of a great nation. Global democracy would surely be less secure without the United States paving the way for worldwide democracy. And the Civil War must be remembered, if for no other cause than to acknowledge 700,000 farmers and clerks, students and laborers, who, for various reasons, put on their region's uniforms, marched off to battle, and never came back. And we must remember as well the grief-stricken mothers, the heartbroken wives and sweethearts. They did not lose life, but they lost the love that gives meaning to life. If only every one of those men and women could know that their sacrifices would, once and for all, unite the states. If only they could know that the world would be better because of what they gave. They do not know these things, but you and I do. And that is why Americans of all ages need to learn and to display those traits during the sesquicentennial years. Let us remember with deserved reverence. As human beings, we cannot do more. As Americans, we must never do less. Thank you.